Life could be a dream. Life could be a dream.
In this video, we will be talking about the 5 great events in the history of Israel. But before that, if you are new in this channel, please like our video and don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell for more updates. Let us recall the history of Israel and see how the authors of Genesis tell us about Abraham, who left Ur in Mesopotamia, went to Haran, and from there continued the journey to Canaan. Please join with me and let's journey together in discovering the 5 great events in the history of Israel. Let's begin with the first event. We call this first event the migration to Canaan. The reason for this migration, though, are still vague. We do not have enough document to provide a definite answer. We can only surmise that it may have been due to a war between the 2 superpowers of that time in that region, Assyria and Babylon, trade, famine, or any other calamity. The group of Abraham traveled quite a distance. He and his group willfully separated themselves from their own people and evolved their own religious beliefs and cultural concepts. The author of Genesis story interprets this happening as Abraham was called by Yahweh, and Abraham, although a pagan, followed the voice of Yahweh and separated from his own people to become the father of the Israelites. Because of the great faith Abraham had shown in him, God offered to make a covenant with Abraham. The word covenant means a solemn agreement between 2 parties, between God and man. The promises God made to Abraham were the following. First, God promised Abraham to become the father of many nations. Second, God will always be the God of Abraham and his descendants. And lastly, the land of Canaan will be given as permanent possession to Abraham and his descendants after him. In a term we say, God promised him posterity, prosperity, and property. On his part, Abraham had to promise that he and his descendants would remain faithful to the covenant forever. That meant that they would worship one God only. The circumcision of all male members of the family was to be the sign of the covenant. After the covenant was sealed, Abraham was no longer called Abram, nor his wife Sarah, Sarai. Names were important in ancient times. A name said something about the person. A change in person's name indicated an important change in the person himself. God's covenant with Abraham and Sarah had changed them radically. Abraham had a son Isaac, who took over the leadership of the clan, the tribe of wandering Hebrews, after the death of Abraham. Isaac had 2 sons, namely Esau and Jacob. Although Esau, being the elder brother, was entitled to receive the birthright of his father, it was actually Jacob who, through the intrigues of his mother, received the blessings of his father and therefore became the leader of the tribe, the wandering Arameans or the Hebrews. Speaking about birthright, the firstborn son of the Hebrew family was the bearer of the birthright. The birthright was very important because it meant that the bearer of it would succeed the father as the head of the family or tribe. He too would receive the material and spiritual blessings of the family. Jacob had 12 sons who were shepherds. They went with their flock from one place to another in order to find food in green pastures. The 12 sons were the following: Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Issachar, Zebulun, Dan, Naphtali, Gad, Asher, Joseph, and Benjamin. As the story goes, Joseph was sold by his own brothers as a slave to a group of Egyptian merchants. He was put in charge of the household of his master. But temptation came in the form of the advances of his master's wife. The wicked wife played a trick on Joseph which landed him in jail. His God-given talent of interpreting dreams brought him out of jail and helped him obtain a high position in the service of the Pharaoh. Dreams were of great importance to the people of those days. The gift of interpreting dreams was highly respected. It was often thought that God spoke to people in dreams. Because of Joseph's attitude and faithfulness, he became famous man in Egypt and was appointed assistant to the Pharaoh, the ruler of Egypt, and was put in charge of the agrarian sector of his government. That event led to a reunion. Joseph was reunited with his family. During that time, a great famine occurred in the Middle East. Due to the abundant food supply in Egypt, many people went there to buy food, including the sons of Jacob. To their surprise, they met and recognized their brother Joseph. Joseph favored his brothers and invited them and his old father to live in Egypt in the area of Goshen. Let us now see the second event. Their stay in Egypt is the second great event. It is called the sojourn in Egypt. Their stay was temporary. It was in that way that the author of Exodus saw it. It was in their interpretation again that Yahweh, who brought his people to Egypt, liberated them from famine and gave them fertile land to use. The Hebrew people multiplied fast and became a real power in Egypt, so much that the Egyptians became afraid that the tribe might become too powerful. Thus they persecuted the Hebrews, their lands were confiscated, the privileges recalled, baby boys were killed upon birth, a cruel family planning program was enforced, etc. The long period of great oppression begun. Moses entered the history of Israel, first as a guerrilla fighter against the oppressive Egyptians. Forced to go into hiding because of the killing of the Egyptian supervisor, he went to Midian where he married the daughter of Jethro, Zipporah. But Moses must have felt uneasy. His mind and heart were constantly with his oppressed people in Egypt. He left Midian and joined his people in Egypt. He felt he should organize them and bring them out of Egypt. This internal struggle within Moses was beautifully told in the story of the burning bush. Thus Moses returned to Egypt as a conscientizer. He mingled with his people, he identified himself with the oppressed and deprived Hebrew slaves. He experienced the unbearable oppression and became the leader of the Hebrews, who were gradually growing in awareness. And after prolonged suffering and a deepening realization of their oppressive situation, they organized themselves under the leadership of Moses and were able to escape from slavery in Egypt. Moving on to the third event, this event with the whole process and happening is the third event, and known as the escape from slavery in Egypt. They escape in small groupings and hid themselves in the mountainous regions of the Sinai desert. Yet, Moses' task is not yet complete. He went around and was able to gather the people. He brought the different tribes together in a Peoples Confederation near the Sinai based on two pillars: first, belief in one God, also known as monotheism, and second, subscription to one religion. Let us see the fourth event in the history of Israel. We call it the Peoples Confederation or Religious Confederation near Sinai. The story of the Ten Commandments is a part of that process of confederation. The desire, however, for greener pastures and the strong conviction of the people and their leader to look for the promised land made the people move from one place to another, till finally, after many adventures, sufferings, and after many years, they arrived at the borders of Canaan, the promised land, known in their stories as the land of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. Let us move to the fifth event. This fifth event is the occupation of the promised land. Under the leadership of Kings David and Solomon, Israel became one of the best organized and wealthiest countries. It was at that time that Israel became a nation. Solomon, however, was not able to manage his power and wealth. He imposed higher taxes, especially in the north. The oppression was greatly felt by the people. After his death, the nation became divided: the northern kingdom, Israel, and the southern kingdom, Judea. At that point, the glory of the once united nation vanished. Weakened because of the separation, the northern kingdom was captured by the superpower in those days, Assyria, in about 700 BC. The entire population was deported to Assyria and never returned. The same happened to the southern kingdom. At about 550 BC, the other superpower Babylon occupied Judea and also deported most of the people. Still, some settled down in Babylon. When under King Cyrus, the Israelites were allowed to return to their country, only a few went back. What they found was an empty, devastated, and alien land. Yet, their deep faith in Yahweh and their adherence to some religion was given renewed life. Apparently, this gave them the courage they needed to rebuild their country. Today, they are oftentimes referred to as the rest of Israel. However, the country was captured again by the fast-growing superpower from the west, Greece, and the Israelites experienced one of the cruelest occupation by a foreign nation. The Greeks tried to replace the people's strong belief in one god with their own museum of gods and goddesses. They were strongly opposed by the people. The Greek occupation started at about 120 BC. Later, in 65 BC, a new superpower from the west was emerging, Rome. They, the Romans, succeeded in toppling the Greeks and took over the Greek-occupied territories. They occupied Israel and included in the Roman Empire. Many Israelite leaders were happy to be rid of the cruel Greeks. They invited the Romans to come and tried to get as many privileges as possible by collaborating with the occupying power. The Jewish people suffered much because of the high taxes imposed by the Romans and their corrupt leaders. It was during this time that Christ was born. When the Hebrews arrive at Canaan, the land promised to them millennia earlier when God told Abraham at Shechem that the land would belong to his descendants, they begin the long, painful, and disappointing process of setting the land. There were, after all, people already living there. These people, the Canaanites, were a Semitic people speaking a language remarkably close to Hebrew. They were farmers, some were nomads, but they were also civilized. They used the great Mesopotamian cities as their model, and had built modest imitations of them. They had also learned military technology and tactics from the Mesopotamians, as well as law. So the Hebrews, uncivilized, tribal, and nomadic, found themselves facing a formidable enemy. Even the accounts of this period in the Hebrew Bible, the books of Joshua and Judges, paint a pretty dreary picture of the occupation. Israelitic Creed. My father was a wandering Aramean, and he went down into Egypt with a few people, and lived there and became a great nation, powerful and numerous. But the Egyptians mistreated us and made us suffer, subjecting us to harsh labor. Then we cried out to the Lord, the God of our ancestors, and the Lord heard our voice and saw our misery, toil, and oppression. So the Lord brought us out of Egypt with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm, with great terror and with signs and wonders. He brought us to this place and gave us this land, a land flowing with milk and honey.